Chestnut Hollow was a town that seemed to have sprung straight from the pages of a holiday card. The cobblestone streets sparkled under the glow of festive lights strung between lampposts, and every window was a display of holly wreaths and candles. The aroma of spiced cider and roasted chestnuts hung in the frosty air. It was a place where Christmas felt tangible, almost like it had its own heartbeat. But for Henry Whitaker, the magic of the season was nothing more than a cruel reminder of what he'd lost. Henry, a retired literature professor, lived in a modest home on the edge of town. The house, once filled with the warmth of family and laughter, now echoed with a deafening silence. 3 years had passed since his only son, Daniel, died in a tragic car accident on Christmas Eve. The pain of that night had carved a canyon in Henry's heart, one so deep he couldn't imagine crossing it. Since then, he had avoided anything that reminded him of the holiday. No tree, no lights, no carols. Just a quiet retreat from a world that seemed to mock his grief with its cheer. On this particular Christmas Eve, Henry found himself wandering the streets of Chestnut Hollow. It wasn't intentional. He'd simply needed to escape the oppressive loneliness of his house. Snowflakes danced around him, landing on his worn overcoat as he passed the bustling crowds in the town square. Families laughed and children tugged at their parents' hands, eager to visit Santa's grotto. Henry kept his head down, his hands buried deep in his pockets. He was nearly invisible in the sea of festive faces. As he neared the park, away from the noise and merriment, Henry spotted a figure huddled on a bench. At first, he thought it was a trick of the dim light, or perhaps just another passerby resting their feet. But as he drew closer, he saw it was a boy, no older than 9 or 10, sitting with his arms wrapped around his knees. The child's thin jacket was no match for the biting cold, and his small frame shivered under the street lamp's pale glow. Henry hesitated. His instinct was to keep walking. What business was it of his? But something about the boy's posture, the way he buried his face against his knees, stopped him in his tracks. It was the universal posture of despair, and it struck a chord deep within Henry. Against his better judgment, he stepped closer. "Hey!" Henry called out, his voice gruff from disuse. "You all right there?" The boy's head shot up, and for a moment, Henry felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The child's face was eerily familiar. It wasn't just the sharp cheekbones or the unruly dark hair. It was the eyes. Wide and full of sorrow, they were the exact shade of gray-blue that Henry had seen every day of his son's life. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He blinked, half expecting the apparition to vanish, but the boy was still there, staring back at him with equal parts fear and curiosity. "I'm fine," the boy mumbled, his voice barely audible over the crunch of snow underfoot. Henry took another step closer, noticing how thin the boy looked, how his shoes were worn down to the sole. "Doesn't seem like it," he said. "Where are your parents?" The boy shrugged, his gaze darting away. "Don't have any." The words hit Henry like a blow. He swallowed the lump in his throat and crouched slightly to meet the boy's eye level. "What's your name?" "Ethan," the boy replied after a long pause. "Ethan, huh?" Henry said softly. "How long have you been out here?" Ethan shrugged again, his small shoulders trembling. "Don't know." "A while." Henry glanced around, his mind racing. The night was only getting colder, and leaving the boy here wasn't an option. Yet, he felt unequipped to handle this situation, a stranger to the role of protector after so many years of solitude. "Well, Ethan," he said finally, "how about you come with me? I've got a warm house just down the road." The boy hesitated, his eyes narrowing as if weighing the offer for hidden danger. Henry couldn't blame him. Trust didn't come easily when you were alone in the world. "I'm not going to hurt you," Henry added, softening his tone. "You look like you could use a meal and some rest. That's all." After a long moment, Ethan gave a tentative nod. Together, they walked through the snow-covered streets, the boy trailing slightly behind as if ready to bolt at any sign of trouble. When they reached Henry's house, the professor opened the door to the dim, quiet space that he'd barely decorated in years. Ethan stepped inside cautiously, his wide eyes scanning the room. Henry gestured toward the worn sofa. "Sit down. I'll get you something hot to eat." Ethan didn't respond, but he perched on the edge of the sofa, his small hands gripping the fabric. Henry disappeared into the kitchen, his mind a whirlwind of questions. Who was this boy, and why did he look so much like Daniel? Was it just a coincidence, or was there something more? As he prepared a bowl of soup, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Ethan's appearance on this snowy night was no accident. Henry returned to the living room with a steaming bowl of soup and a thick slice of bread, his hands steady despite the turmoil brewing in his mind. Ethan was still perched on the edge of the couch, his small frame hunched over as if he were ready to flee at any moment. Henry placed the bowl on the coffee table and stepped back, giving the boy space. "Eat," he said simply, folding his arms and leaning against the doorway. Ethan hesitated, his eyes flicking between Henry and the food. Hunger won out, and he reached for the bowl, his fingers trembling as he picked up the spoon. Henry watched in silence as the boy devoured the meal with a quiet intensity, as if he couldn't be sure when he'd eat again. It was a sight that stirred something deep within Henry, a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. "Slow down," Henry said gently. "There's plenty." Ethan paused, glancing up at him with a mixture of embarrassment and defiance. "I'm fine," he muttered, though he did slow his pace slightly. Henry walked to the old armchair across from the couch and lowered himself into it, the springs creaking under his weight. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were the scrape of Ethan's spoon against the bowl and the faint whistle of wind outside. Henry studied the boy carefully, trying to piece together the puzzle that had landed him on that park bench tonight. He had so many questions, but he knew better than to push too hard. When Ethan finished, he leaned back slightly, his body visibly relaxing for the first time. "Thanks," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry nodded. "You're welcome." He hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. "You said you don't have any parents. What about other family? Someone who might be looking for you?" Ethan's expression tightened, his gaze dropping to the floor. "No one's looking for me." The weight of those words settled heavily in the room. Henry felt an ache in his chest, a familiar pang of loss and regret. He cleared his throat. "Where were you before? Before you ended up in the park?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his small hands twisting in his lap. "An orphanage," he admitted. "But it was bad there. The people weren't nice. So I left." Henry frowned. He'd heard stories about underfunded orphanages and the neglect that often plagued them, but hearing it from a child sitting in his living room made it painfully real. "How long have you been on your own?" Ethan shrugged. "A few weeks, maybe. I don't know." "Weeks?" Henry's heart sank. He couldn't imagine a boy this young surviving alone for that long, especially in the harsh winter cold. He opened his mouth to respond, but something caught his eye. On Ethan's wrist was a thin leather bracelet, worn and frayed, with a small metal plate attached. He hadn't noticed it before, but now the sight of it sent a jolt through him. "Where did you get that bracelet?" Henry asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Ethan instinctively pulled his sleeve down, hiding the bracelet from view. "It was my mom's," he said cautiously. "She gave it to me before she went away." Henry's breath caught. "May I see it?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes narrowing with suspicion, but after a long moment, he pushed his sleeve up and extended his arm. Henry leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly as he took a closer look. The bracelet was simple, but the name engraved on the plate stopped him cold. Mary. The room seemed to tilt, and Henry sat back abruptly, his mind racing. Mary had been his wife's name. She'd worn a bracelet just like this one for years, a gift from him early in their marriage. He could still picture it clearly on her wrist, the way the metal had caught the light. Could it be a coincidence? Or was there something more? "Your mother," Henry said carefully, his voice low. "What was her name?" Ethan hesitated, his brow furrowing as if he were trying to decide whether to trust him. "Amanda," he finally said. "Amanda Grayson." The name hit Henry like a thunderclap. Amanda had worked at the library in Chestnut Hollow years ago. She'd been kind and soft-spoken, with a shy smile and a love of books that had reminded him of his own son, Daniel. The two had struck up a quiet friendship, often chatting about literature or sharing coffee in the library's break room. But then, one day, Amanda had disappeared without warning. No one seemed to know where she'd gone or why. Henry's pulse quickened. Could Amanda have been connected to Daniel? Could Ethan be? "Did your mom ever mention someone named Daniel?" he asked, his voice tight. Ethan's eyes widened slightly, and Henry knew the answer before the boy spoke. "She talked about him sometimes," Ethan admitted. "She said he was a good man, someone she cared about." The pieces began to fall into place, but the picture they formed was almost too much for Henry to comprehend. If Amanda and Daniel had been involved, and if Ethan was her son, that meant. Henry rose abruptly, pacing the room as he tried to make sense of it all. The boy sitting on his couch wasn't just a random stranger. He was family, his grandson. Ethan watched him warily, his small body tensing as if ready to bolt. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked, his voice trembling. Henry stopped, turning to face him. "No," he said quickly. "You didn't do anything wrong. I need to think." He sank back into the armchair, his head in his hands. For years, he'd thought his connection to Daniel had been severed forever, that he'd lost the last thread of his family. But now, here was Ethan, a living, breathing link to his son. It was overwhelming, almost too much to bear. Yet, beneath the shock and confusion, Henry felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The next morning, Henry woke early, though he hadn't slept much. The realization of Ethan's connection to Daniel had kept his mind racing throughout the night. He had replayed every memory of his son, searching for clues he might have missed, times when Daniel had seemed distant or preoccupied. Now, the boy who slept on his couch represented a second chance, a bridge to the son he had lost. But what did he do with this knowledge? And how could he tell Ethan without scaring him away? He tiptoed into the living room, where Ethan was still curled up on the couch under an old quilt. His face, soft and peaceful in sleep, reminded Henry so much of Daniel that it made his chest ache. He stood there for a moment, wrestling with the swirl of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Then, quietly, he moved to the kitchen to make breakfast. The smell of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee soon filled the house. Ethan stirred, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. When he saw Henry in the kitchen, his expression softened, though the guardedness that seemed ever present in him lingered. "Morning," Ethan mumbled, pulling the quilt around his shoulders as he shuffled toward the table. "Morning," Henry replied, setting a plate of scrambled eggs and bacon in front of the boy. He noticed how Ethan hesitated, his hands hovering over the food like he was waiting for permission. "Go on, eat," Henry urged. "No one's going to take it from you." Ethan nodded, digging in with quiet determination. Henry sat across from him, nursing his coffee and watching the boy eat. He wanted to ask so many questions, but he didn't want to push too hard, too fast. He decided to start with something simple. "You sleep okay?" Ethan shrugged, his mouth full. After a moment, he swallowed and said, "Better than outside." Henry smiled faintly, though the thought of Ethan sleeping outside in the cold twisted his stomach. "Well, you're safe here," he said. "You can stay as long as you need to." Ethan froze for a moment, his fork midway to his mouth. "Why?" he asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. "Why are you being so nice to me?" Henry leaned back in his chair, caught off guard by the question. How could he explain the storm of emotions Ethan had stirred in him without revealing the truth too soon? He settled on honesty, at least, as much as he could manage for now. "Because no one should be alone," he said. "Especially not on Christmas." Ethan stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then he looked down at his plate and resumed eating. Henry decided to let the silence linger, giving the boy space to process his words. After breakfast, Ethan helped Henry wash the dishes, though it was clear he wasn't used to being in a kitchen. His small hands fumbled with the plates, and Henry had to show him how to hold the sponge without dropping it. Despite the boy's initial awkwardness, there was a determination in his movements that made Henry smile. Once the kitchen was clean, Henry decided it was time to address the bracelet. He had spent the night going over every detail he could remember about Amanda and her sudden disappearance. The pieces didn't all fit yet, but the connection to Daniel was undeniable. He needed answers, and Ethan might be the only one who could provide them. "Ethan," Henry said as they sat back down at the table, Can you tell me more about your mom? Ethan stiffened, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. Why do you care? Henry hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Because I think I might have known her. A long time ago. Ethan's eyes narrowed. You knew her? I think so, Henry said gently. I used to work at the library in town, and there was a woman named Amanda who worked there too. She was kind, smart, and she loved books. Your mom loved books too, didn't she? Ethan nodded slowly, though he still looked wary. Yeah, she read to me every night before bed. Even when she was tired, Henry felt a lump rise in his throat. He could picture Amanda, sitting on a library stool with her head bent over a book, her soft voice carrying through the quiet space. The thought of her reading to Ethan, of her trying to create a warm, loving world for her son even when circumstances were hard, only deepened his conviction to help the boy. Do you know why she left the library? Henry asked. Why she left Chestnut Hollow? Ethan shook his head. She didn't talk about it much. Just said she had to go. That it wasn't safe here. The words sent a chill through Henry. Safe from what? Or from whom? He didn't want to alarm Ethan, but he knew there was more to the story than the boy realized. She was friends with my son, Daniel, Henry said, his voice soft. Did she ever mention him to you? Ethan's eyes widened slightly, and Henry could see the wheels turning in the boy's mind. After a long pause, Ethan nodded. She talked about him sometimes. She said he was a good man, someone she trusted. Henry's heart twisted. Did she ever say anything else? About him? About what happened? Ethan shook his head. No, just that he helped her when she needed it. Henry nodded slowly, his thoughts racing. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he was sure of one thing. Ethan wasn't just a boy who had crossed his path by chance. He was a part of his family, and Henry was determined to uncover the truth. Ethan, Henry said, his voice steady, I want you to know something. Whatever happens, you're not alone anymore. You have me now. Ethan looked at him, his expression a mixture of skepticism and cautious hope. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Ethan nodded. Okay, he said softly. Henry smiled, a warmth spreading through his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose again, and he wasn't going to let this second chance slip away. The next few days brought a cautious rhythm to the small household. Henry and Ethan fell into an unspoken routine. Meals shared in quiet companionship, afternoons spent tending to small chores, and evenings by the fireplace where Ethan would slowly let his guard down. It was a fragile sort of peace, held together by mutual understanding rather than words. Still, Henry felt the growing need to confront the mysteries swirling around Ethan and his connection to Daniel. He decided it was time to dig deeper, even if it meant stirring emotions he wasn't sure either of them were ready to face. On a cold afternoon, Henry suggested they go through the attic to find a few extra blankets. It gets colder up there at night, he said, though he had other motives in mind. The attic was filled with relics of his life with Mary and Daniel. Photographs, letters, keepsakes that had gathered dust in the years since their deaths. He hadn't dared venture up there since losing Daniel. But now, with Ethan here, it felt like the right moment. Ethan was hesitant at first, but curiosity got the better of him. The boy followed Henry up the narrow staircase, his small feet padding softly against the wooden steps. The attic smelled faintly of cedar and thyme, a mixture of old boxes and forgotten memories. Henry pulled a chain to illuminate a single bulb, its soft light casting shadows across the room. Wow, Ethan said, his wide eyes scanning the stacks of boxes and furniture draped in white sheets. It's like a treasure chest. Henry smiled faintly, his hands brushing over a box labeled Christmas. Yeah, I suppose it is. Ethan moved cautiously through the space, his fingers skimming the edge of an old trunk. He paused at a shelf filled with books, pulling one out and flipping through its yellowed pages. Henry watched him from the corner of his eye, feeling a mix of nostalgia and sadness. This boy, his grandson, was exploring pieces of a family he'd never known, yet somehow belonged to. Here, Henry said, pulling a smaller box down from a high shelf. This should have a couple of blankets in it. Ethan helped him tug the box to the floor, his small hands eager to be useful. Together, they opened it, revealing not just blankets but a collection of old photographs and trinkets. Henry froze for a moment, his breath catching as memories spilled out in front of him. "Who's that?" Ethan asked, picking up a framed photo of a young man standing next to a Christmas tree. "That's Daniel," Henry said, his voice soft. "My son." Ethan stared at the photo for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "He looks happy." He was, Henry said, his gaze distant. Christmas was always his favorite time of year. Ethan carefully placed the photo back in the box, his small fingers lingering on the frame. Did he know my mom? Henry hesitated, his heart tightening. "Yes," he said finally. "They were close." Ethan didn't ask more, and Henry didn't push. Instead, they continued sorting through the box, finding old ornaments and holiday cards. It wasn't until Ethan pulled out a small leather journal that the air seemed to shift. He held it up, his eyes curious. "What's this?" Henry took the journal from him, his hands trembling slightly as he recognized it. "It's Daniel's," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He used to write in it all the time. Can I read it?" Ethan asked cautiously. Henry hesitated. The journal was a piece of Daniel that he hadn't touched since his death, a private window into his son's thoughts. But as he looked at Ethan, he realized that this boy had as much right to know Daniel as anyone. He handed the journal back. "Go ahead," he said softly. Ethan opened the journal carefully, as if it might fall apart in his hands. The first few entries were mundane, notes about school, sketches of ideas for short stories. But as he flipped further, his expression changed. He looked up at Henry, his voice barely audible. "He talks about her." "My mom." Henry's heart skipped. "What does it say?" Ethan read aloud, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I never thought I'd meet someone like Amanda. She's kind and quiet, but there's a strength in her I can't ignore. I want to help her, but I don't know how." Henry sat back, the words washing over him like a wave. He remembered how Daniel had been drawn to people who needed help, how his heart had been as big as his dreams. It didn't surprise him that Daniel had tried to protect Amanda. It was exactly what his son would have done. As Ethan continued reading, Henry pieced together more of the story. Daniel had been there for Amanda during a difficult time, offering her a safe place to stay when she had nowhere else to go. The entries hinted at something deeper, a bond that had grown between them, but there were no direct mentions of Ethan or a child. Still, the pieces were falling into place. When Ethan finished, he looked up at Henry, his gray-blue eyes filled with questions. "Do you think he knew about me?" Henry's throat tightened. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if he did, I'm sure he would have loved you, just like he loved her." Ethan nodded slowly, as if trying to absorb the weight of Henry's words. He closed the journal gently and set it back in the box. "I wish I could have met him." Henry's chest ached. "Me too," he said softly. "But I'm glad you're here. I'm glad I get to know you." Ethan didn't respond, but his small smile spoke volumes. For the first time, the gap between them seemed to shrink, and Henry felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't just uncovering the past, he was building a future, one where neither of them had to be alone. The days after their discovery in the attic were quiet, but filled with an unspoken bond growing between Henry and Ethan. Henry found himself studying the boy's every move, noticing the subtle ways he reminded him of Daniel. The tilt of his head when he was curious, the way his brow furrowed when he was deep in thought. The journal had been a bridge, offering them both a sense of Daniel's presence, but it also left behind questions that lingered in Henry's mind like restless shadows. One snowy afternoon, Henry decided to visit an old friend who had been a confidant of both his late wife, Mary, and, more importantly, Amanda. Mrs. Hargrove was a retired teacher who had lived in Chestnut Hollow for decades. She was known for her sharp memory and no-nonsense attitude, and Henry hoped she might provide the missing pieces of the puzzle. "Ethan," Henry said as he buttoned his coat by the front door, "how about a little walk? There's someone I think we should visit." Ethan looked up from the book he'd been thumbing through, a tattered copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer that Henry had pulled from the attic. "Who?" "A friend of your mom's," Henry replied. "She might know more about her." Ethan's brow furrowed in thought, but he set the book aside and grabbed his coat without protest. They stepped out into the crisp air, the snow crunching underfoot as they made their way toward the older part of town. Mrs. Hargrove lived in a cozy stone cottage near the edge of the woods, her yard dotted with bird feeders and a well-worn bench that seemed perpetually dusted with snow in winter. When Henry knocked on the door, it creaked open almost immediately, revealing the elderly woman, wrapped in a thick cardigan and clutching a steaming mug of tea. "Henry Whitaker," she exclaimed, her eyes twinkling with surprise. "And who's this young man?" "This is Ethan," Henry said, resting a hand lightly on the boy's shoulder. He's family." Mrs. Hargrove's gaze softened, and she stepped aside to let them in. The smell of cinnamon and cloves greeted them as they entered the warm, cluttered living room. Henry and Ethan took seats on the floral-patterned couch while Mrs. Hargrove settled into her armchair. "What brings you here, Henry?" she asked, her eyes flicking curiously to Ethan. Henry took a deep breath, unsure of how much to reveal. "I've been trying to piece together something about Amanda Grayson," he began. "You remember her, don't you?" Mrs. Hargrove's face darkened slightly, and she set her mug down on a side table. "Of course I do," she said. "Such a sweet girl, but troubled. She came to me a few times when things were difficult." Ethan leaned forward, his small hands gripping the edge of the couch. "What kind of difficult?" he asked. Mrs. Hargrove hesitated, her gaze softening as she looked at him. "Amanda was running from someone," she said carefully. "She never told me all the details, but I know she was scared. Scared for herself and scared for you." Henry's chest tightened. "Do you know who it was? Why she left Chestnut Hollow so suddenly?" Mrs. Hargrove shook her head. "She wouldn't say, but I know she trusted Daniel. She spoke about him often, how he was one of the few people she felt safe with." Ethan's eyes flickered with recognition, and Henry reached out to rest a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Do you think this person, whoever she was afraid of, might still be looking for her?" Henry asked. Mrs. Hargrove sighed. "It's possible, but it's been years now, Henry. If Amanda was still being pursued, I imagine it would have come to light by now." Henry nodded, though the conversation left him uneasy. As much as he wanted to believe Amanda's troubles had been left in the past, there was a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach that they weren't entirely free from danger. After thanking Mrs. Hargrove, Henry and Ethan made their way home. The walk back was quieter, both of them lost in thought. When they reached the house, Ethan finally broke the silence. "Do you think she was scared because of me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry stopped and turned to face him. "No, Ethan," he said firmly. "She was scared because she loved you. She wanted to protect you." Ethan nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. Henry wanted to say more, to reassure him, but he knew there were limits to what words could do. Instead, he led Ethan inside, where the warmth of the house and the glow of the fireplace offered a small measure of comfort. Later that evening, as Ethan drifted off to sleep on the couch, Henry sat in his armchair, staring into the flickering flames. He couldn't shake the feeling that their time in Chestnut Hollow was drawing attention they couldn't afford. If Amanda's past was as tangled as it seemed, then Ethan's safety wasn't something he could take for granted. Pulling Daniel's journal from the coffee table, Henry thumbed through the pages again, searching for anything he might have overlooked. One passage caught his eye. "She says she doesn't want to stay here, that it's too dangerous. But I told her she doesn't have to face it alone. I'll protect her, no matter what." Henry closed the journal, his resolve hardening. Whatever dangers Amanda had faced, whatever secrets she'd carried, they had now become his to bear. He had failed to protect Daniel, but he would not fail Ethan. This boy deserved a chance at the life his mother had fought so hard to give him, and Henry would do whatever it took to make sure he had it. As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Henry made a silent promise to himself and to the boy sleeping just a few feet away. He would uncover the truth, no matter where it led, and he would keep Ethan safe. Always. The following morning, Henry was jolted awake by the sound of a car pulling into his driveway. He sat up in his armchair, disoriented, the journal still resting on his lap. Ethan was already at the window, peeking through the curtain with a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. "Someone's here," Ethan whispered, his voice tense. Henry stood, stretching his stiff limbs, and moved to the door. His first instinct was caution. Chestnut Hollow wasn't the kind of town where visitors arrived unannounced, especially not this early. When he opened the door, his heart sank. A man in a tailored coat stood at the foot of the porch, his sharp features and cold eyes cutting through the crisp morning air. Behind him, a sleek black car idled in the driveway. "Mr. Whitaker," the man said, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. "I'm Thomas Grayson. I believe you've met my nephew." Henry stiffened, his hand tightening on the doorknob. He glanced back at Ethan, whose face had gone pale. "What do you want?" Henry asked, his voice steady but edged with suspicion. Thomas offered a thin smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've come to discuss Ethan. I understand he's been staying with you." Henry stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind him to shield Ethan from the conversation. "He has, and as far as I'm concerned, he'll continue to stay here." Thomas tilted his head, his expression almost amused. "That's noble of you, Mr. Whitaker, but I'm afraid this situation is more complicated than you realize. Ethan is my blood relative, and I have a responsibility to ensure his welfare." Henry's jaw tightened. And where was that sense of responsibility when he was alone in the snow? When he was running from an orphanage? Thomas's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "I'm here now, aren't I? And I can provide him with a life you can't. A stable home, access to the best schools, financial security." Henry's anger flared, but he kept his voice calm. What Ethan needs isn't money or privilege. He needs someone who cares about him, someone who won't treat him like a burden or a pawn. Thomas's eyes darkened. "You think I see him that way?" "I think you see him as an opportunity," Henry said bluntly, "and I won't let you take him away from here." The two men stared at each other, the tension between them thick and unyielding. Finally, Thomas straightened, adjusting his coat with deliberate precision. "You may think you're doing what's best for him, Mr. Whitaker, but the law will have the final say. I've already contacted my attorney. Expect to hear from us soon." With that, he turned and walked back to his car, his movements brisk and purposeful. Henry watched him drive away, his mind racing. He had no doubt Thomas would follow through on his threat. The question was why? What could he possibly gain from taking Ethan? When Henry returned inside, Ethan was sitting on the couch, his arms wrapped around his knees. "Who was that?" the boy asked, his voice small. "Someone who thinks he knows what's best for you," Henry said, sitting down beside him. "But don't worry, I won't let him take you." Ethan looked up at him, his gray-blue eyes filled with uncertainty. Can he take me?" Henry hesitated, hating that he couldn't give the boy the reassurance he deserved. "Not if I have anything to say about it," he said firmly. "We'll figure this out together." Ethan nodded, though the worry in his expression didn't fade. Henry reached out, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I promise, Ethan, you're not going anywhere." The days that followed were a blur of phone calls and paperwork. Henry reached out to a local attorney, a kind woman named Claire who had been a student of his years ago. She agreed to take the case, though she warned him that it wouldn't be easy. "Thomas Grayson has resources, Henry," she said during their first meeting. "And judges tend to favor blood relatives in custody disputes. He's not doing this because he cares about Ethan," Henry argued. "There's something else at play." Claire nodded thoughtfully. "If we can prove that, it'll help. But we'll need evidence." Henry spent hours combing through every scrap of information he could find, both in Daniel's journal and his own memories. He visited the library, hoping to uncover more about Amanda's time in Chestnut Hollow, but the records were sparse. It was as if she had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions. Ethan, meanwhile, tried to keep himself busy, though Henry could see the strain wearing on him. The boy spent most of his time in the attic, going through boxes and flipping through old books. One evening, he came down holding a small envelope, his expression cautious. "I found this," he said, handing it to Henry. Henry took the envelope, his heart racing. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably Daniel's, though the paper was yellowed with age. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully. Henry unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words. Dear Dad, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to tell you in person. Amanda is pregnant. I don't know how to feel. Scared, excited, overwhelmed. But I want to be there for her, for our child. I want to be the kind of father you always were to me. I hope you can forgive me for not telling you sooner. Love, Daniel. Henry's hands trembled as he read the letter. He felt a surge of emotions, grief, pride, and an overwhelming sense of purpose. This was the proof they needed, not just for the court but for Ethan. He had a right to know that his father had loved him, even if he hadn't lived to see him grow. The next morning, Henry met with Claire to show her the letter. She read it carefully, her expression thoughtful. This could make a difference, she said. It establishes Daniel's intent to be a part of Ethan's life. It shows that he cared. It's more than that, Henry said quietly. It's a connection. Something Ethan needs. Claire nodded. We'll present it to the judge. But Henry, you need to be prepared. This might not be enough on its own. Thomas Grayson will fight hard. Henry squared his shoulders. Let him. I'll fight harder. The day of the court hearing arrived faster than Henry anticipated. He and Ethan sat side by side in the small courtroom, their hands clasped tightly together. Thomas was there too, his lawyer a sharp-looking man who seemed to exude confidence. Henry's heart pounded as the judge entered, the gavel striking the wooden block to call the session to order. As the proceedings began, Henry felt the weight of every argument, every piece of evidence. He watched as Thomas's lawyer painted him as an unfit guardian, a lonely old man clinging to a boy out of misplaced guilt. But when it was Claire's turn, she stood tall, presenting the letter and Daniel's journal with calm determination. This isn't just about biology, Claire said, her voice steady. It's about love, about intention. Daniel Whitaker wanted to be a father to Ethan, and Henry Whitaker is here to honor that commitment. The courtroom was silent as the judge reviewed the documents. Henry held his breath, his hands still clutching Ethan's. The gavel came down, and the judge spoke. The gavel's echo lingered in the small courtroom, filling the space with a heavy silence. Henry sat frozen, his hand gripping Ethan's tightly, as the judge looked up from the papers before him. The judge, an older man with sharp features softened only slightly by his gray hair, folded his hands and leaned forward. I've reviewed the evidence presented, the judge began, his voice measured. This case is not just about determining custody, but about considering what is in the best interest of the child, Ethan Grayson. Both parties have presented compelling arguments. Henry's heart pounded, each beat thundering in his ears. He glanced at Ethan, who sat rigidly in his chair, his eyes locked on the judge. Mr. Grayson has demonstrated that he has the financial resources and stability to provide for Ethan, the judge continued. However, evidence has been presented that raises questions about his motivations, particularly regarding Ethan's inheritance and connection to the Whitaker family. Thomas Grayson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening. Henry resisted the urge to look his way, focusing instead on the judge. Mr. Whitaker, the judge said, turning his gaze toward Henry, has shown not only a willingness but an active effort to provide a loving, stable environment for Ethan. The letters and journal entries from Daniel Whitaker strongly indicate an intent to be a father to this child, and Henry Whitaker has demonstrated his commitment to honoring that legacy. Ethan's grip on Henry's hand tightened. Henry could feel the boy trembling beside him, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of them. After careful consideration, the judge said, his voice firm, I am granting custody of Ethan Grayson to Henry Whitaker. The words hung in the air for a moment before their meaning fully sank in. Henry exhaled, a shaky breath that carried weeks of tension and fear. Ethan turned to him, his wide eyes filled with relief and something else, hope. Thank you, Your Honor, Henry said, his voice breaking slightly. The judge nodded, his expression softening. Take care of him, Mr. Whitaker. And young man, he added, looking at Ethan, you're lucky to have someone who cares so deeply for you. Ethan nodded, unable to speak. As the gavel struck once more, the proceedings came to a close. Henry wrapped his arm around Ethan's shoulders, pulling the boy close as they stood to leave. For the first time in what felt like forever, Henry allowed himself to believe that things might be okay. Outside the courthouse, the winter sun shone brightly, the light glinting off the fresh snow that blanketed the streets. Claire met them on the steps, her smile warm and triumphant. "Well done, Henry," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "I had my doubts, but the judge saw the truth. Ethan belongs with you." "Thank you, Claire," Henry said sincerely. "I couldn't have done this without you." Claire crouched down to Ethan's level, her expression kind. "You've got a good man looking out for you, kiddo. Don't ever forget that." Ethan nodded, his small smile shy but genuine. "Thank you," he whispered. As they walked back to the car, Henry felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. Ethan's small hand slipped into his, and he held it tightly, as if anchoring them both to the moment. The battle was over, but Henry knew their journey was just beginning. The following days were a whirlwind of adjustments. The house, which had once been filled with echoes of loss, now buzzed with new life. Ethan settled into a routine, helping Henry with small chores and spending hours poring over the books they'd found in the attic. Henry, in turn, found himself rediscovering the joy of sharing his home and his life with someone else. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Ethan hesitated before speaking. "Do you think my mom would be happy?" he asked, his voice soft. Henry set down his mug of tea, his eyes meeting Ethan's. "I think she'd be proud," he said. "She fought so hard to protect you, Ethan. And I think she'd be glad to know you're safe." Ethan nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I miss her," he said quietly. "But it doesn't feel so bad now. Like I'm not so alone." "You're not alone," Henry said firmly. "Not anymore." As Christmas approached, the spirit of the season began to creep back into their lives. Ethan, who had never experienced the warmth of a true holiday celebration, was fascinated by the decorations that lined the streets of Chestnut Hollow. Henry found himself drawn into the festivities as well, spurred on by Ethan's excitement. One snowy afternoon, they ventured into town to pick out a Christmas tree. Henry hadn't put one up since Daniel's death, but this year felt different. They wandered through rows of evergreens, the scent of pine filling the air, until Ethan stopped in front of a modest tree with slightly uneven branches. "This one," Ethan said, his voice decisive. "It's perfect." Henry chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "If you say so." Back home, they spent hours decorating the tree with the ornaments they'd found in the attic. Each one carried a story, and Henry shared memories of Daniel and Mary as they worked. Ethan listened intently, his eyes bright with curiosity and wonder. By the time they finished, the tree sparkled with lights and memories, a testament to the family they were rebuilding. They sat together on the couch, admiring their handiwork as the fire crackled in the hearth. "Looks pretty good," Henry said, his voice warm. "It's the best tree ever," Ethan declared, his smile wide. Henry smiled, his heart full. For the first time in years, he felt whole, a feeling he hadn't thought possible. Ethan had brought light back into his life, and in return, he was determined to give the boy the love and security he deserved. On Christmas Eve, as the snow fell softly outside, they sat together by the fire, reading from one of Daniel's favorite books. Ethan's head rested on Henry's shoulder, his voice steady as he read aloud. Henry closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him, a balm for his weary soul. When Ethan finished, he looked up at Henry, his expression serious. "I'm glad you found me," he said. Henry swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "No, Ethan," he said softly. "I'm the lucky one. You saved me." Ethan smiled, and in that moment, Henry knew that the pain of the past had given way to something stronger: hope, love, and the promise of a new beginning. As the clock struck midnight, marking the arrival of Christmas, Henry and Ethan sat together, their bond unbreakable, their hearts full, and their future bright. Christmas morning arrived quietly, with the sun casting a soft golden glow over the snow-covered town. Henry stirred awake to the faint sound of Ethan in the living room, his small footsteps muffled on the carpet. Pulling himself out of bed, Henry padded down the hall, his robe wrapped tightly around him against the morning chill. Ethan was sitting cross-legged in front of the Christmas tree, his face illuminated by the soft twinkle of the lights. He was inspecting a small wrapped package that had Henry's name on it, his expression a mix of excitement and curiosity. "Morning," Henry said, his voice warm as he stepped into the room. Ethan jumped slightly, then smiled sheepishly. "Morning. I was just looking," Henry chuckled, easing himself into the armchair. "Well, go on then. You've got some under there with your name on them." Ethan's eyes widened, and he hesitated. I didn't think there'd be anything for me." Henry's chest tightened. "Of course there's something for you," he said gently. "Go ahead." Ethan crawled toward the tree, his fingers brushing over the tags on the modest pile of gifts. He picked one up with his name scrawled in Henry's neat handwriting and sat back, holding it reverently for a moment before carefully peeling back the paper. Inside was a hardcover book, The Secret Garden, bound in deep green with gilded lettering. Ethan traced the title with his fingertips, his face lighting up. "I saw you looking at it in the bookstore," Henry said, smiling. "Figured it might make a good addition to your collection." Ethan looked up at him, his expression earnest. "Thank you. I've never had my own books before." Henry nodded, his heart aching at the boy's words. "Well, now you've got one. And there's more where that came from." They spent the morning opening the rest of the gifts. Most were small and practical. New gloves, a scarf, a few toys Ethan had never expected but lit up at receiving. Henry found joy in the boy's happiness, a feeling that grew as Ethan's laughter filled the house. Later that afternoon, as the snow began to fall again, Henry prepared a simple Christmas dinner. He'd set the table with the good dishes, something he hadn't done in years. Ethan sat nearby, helping where he could, though he mostly watched Henry with quiet admiration. As they sat down to eat, Ethan looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the tree, the table, and finally on Henry. "This is the best Christmas ever," he said softly. Henry smiled, though his throat tightened with emotion. "It's the first of many," he promised. After dinner, they curled up by the fire once more, Henry with a mug of tea and Ethan with a plate of cookies he'd insisted on saving for dessert. They talked about the stories they'd read, about Ethan's favorite parts of the day, and about plans for the rest of the winter. But as the evening wore on, Henry noticed a flicker of hesitation in Ethan's demeanor. The boy seemed quieter, his gaze drifting more often toward the fire. Finally, Henry set his mug down and leaned forward. "What's on your mind, Ethan?" Ethan looked up at him, his gray-blue eyes shadowed with uncertainty. "Do you think he'll come back?" Henry frowned, his jaw tightening. "I don't think so," he said carefully. "The judge's decision is final." "But he was so sure," Ethan said, his voice small, like he couldn't lose. Henry considered this for a moment. He didn't want to worry Ethan unnecessarily, but he also couldn't dismiss the boy's instincts. Thomas Grayson was a man who didn't take defeat lightly, and Henry had no doubt he would try something. The question was when and how. "Listen to me," Henry said firmly. "No matter what happens, I'm not going to let him take you. You're safe here, Ethan. I'll make sure of it." Ethan nodded, though his expression remained troubled. Henry reached out, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're not alone in this, all right? We'll face whatever comes together." The reassurance seemed to ease Ethan's tension, and the boy leaned into Henry's side. They stayed like that for a while, the warmth of the fire wrapping around them like a blanket. As the days turned into weeks, the peaceful routine they'd built began to feel like home. Ethan started school in the new year, and though he was nervous at first, he quickly found his footing. Henry took pride in helping him with homework in the evenings, marveling at the boy's quick mind and eagerness to learn. But the shadow of Thomas Grayson loomed. Though Henry hadn't heard from him directly since the court decision, he knew better than to assume the man had given up. One evening, as he sorted through the mail, Henry found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with 3 words scrawled in bold, jagged handwriting. "This isn't over." Henry's grip tightened on the letter, his jaw clenching. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket, unwilling to let Ethan see it. But the message was clear. Thomas wasn't going away quietly. Over the next few days, Henry took extra precautions. He made sure Ethan was never alone, even walking him to and from school. He spoke with Claire, who assured him that the custody ruling was legally binding but agreed to help monitor for any suspicious activity. Still, The unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of their newfound happiness. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Ethan looked up from his book and said, "Do you ever feel like something bad is coming?" Henry's heart ached at the question. He set his own book aside and met the boy's gaze. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But you know what I do when I feel that way?" Ethan shook his head. "I remind myself that I'm not facing it alone," Henry said. "And neither are you." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm glad you're here," he said quietly. "And I'm glad you're here," Henry replied. "No matter what comes, we'll face it together." As the fire crackled softly, Henry felt a renewed sense of determination. Thomas Grayson might still be out there, but Henry wasn't the same man he'd been before Ethan entered his life. He had something to fight for now, something worth protecting at all costs, and he wasn't going to let anything take it away. Winter deepened in Chestnut Hollow, blanketing the town in snow that seemed to muffle the world. The cozy routines Henry and Ethan had built became their refuge, a small, warm bubble against the chill outside. Yet, despite the quiet days and the laughter they shared, Henry couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was subtle, an unfamiliar car parked too long on their street, the way the phone rang once and then stopped, but it was enough to keep him on edge. Henry didn't share his worries with Ethan. The boy had finally begun to feel safe, his once constant wariness giving way to moments of genuine joy. Henry couldn't bear to take that from him, but he prepared in other ways, keeping a close watch on Ethan's comings and goings, locking the doors every night, and speaking regularly with Claire to ensure their legal standing was secure. One snowy evening, while Henry was preparing dinner, Ethan burst through the front door, his cheeks flushed from the cold. "Henry," he called, his excitement bubbling over. "I got an A on my history quiz." Henry turned from the stove, smiling at the boy's exuberance. "An A? That's fantastic, Ethan. I'm proud of you." Ethan grinned, holding up the paper as if it were a trophy. "Mrs. Olson said I wrote one of the best essays in the class." "Well, that deserves a celebration," Henry said, reaching into the pantry for a box of cocoa mix. "How about some hot chocolate after dinner?" Ethan's eyes lit up. "With marshmallows?" "Of course," Henry said with a chuckle. "What's hot chocolate without marshmallows?" As they sat down to eat, Ethan chattered about his day, describing every detail of his classes with an enthusiasm that warmed Henry's heart. But as they finished their meal and moved to the living room, the phone rang. Henry's stomach tightened. He hadn't been able to ignore the odd calls that had started a week ago, though he hadn't mentioned them to Ethan. "Stay here," Henry said softly, rising to answer the phone. The line was silent for a moment after he picked up, and then a familiar voice spoke. "Mr. Whitaker," Thomas Grayson said, his tone smooth but carrying an edge. "I trust you've been enjoying your time with Ethan." Henry's grip on the receiver tightened. "What do you want, Grayson?" "I told you this wasn't over," Thomas said, his voice low. "Ethan belongs with me. You may have convinced a judge otherwise, but the law can be flexible." Henry's chest burned with anger. "The court made its decision. You need to accept it and leave us alone." Thomas chuckled, a sound that made Henry's skin crawl. "You're underestimating me, Mr. Whitaker. I always get what I want, and I won't stop until Ethan is where he belongs." The line went dead. Henry stood there for a moment, his heart pounding. He forced himself to take a deep breath before turning back to the living room, where Ethan was flipping through one of his books. "Who was it?" Ethan asked, looking up. "Just a telemarketer," Henry lied, his voice calm. "Nothing important." Ethan nodded, returning his attention to his book, but Henry couldn't shake the unease that settled in his chest. Thomas's threat was real, and Henry knew the man wasn't bluffing. He had to act before it was too late. The next day, Henry visited Claire's office, bringing the letter he'd received and recounting the phone call. Claire's expression grew grim as she listened. "This is harassment," she said, leaning forward. "If he contacts you again, we can file a restraining order. But Henry, if he's serious about challenging the custody ruling, we need to be ready. What more can we do?" Henry asked, his voice tight. "The judge ruled in my favor. Judges can be persuaded to revisit cases," Claire said, "especially if Grayson can present new evidence or claim some sort of emergency." Henry's fist clenched. He's trying to scare us. He doesn't care about Ethan. He just wants control. Claire nodded. I believe you, but we need to be proactive. I'll file a motion to secure the ruling and notify the court about the harassment. In the meantime, keep a record of every interaction. Thank you, Claire, Henry said. I'll do whatever it takes to protect him. As Henry left the office, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. He knew Ethan was beginning to sense his tension, though the boy hadn't said anything. That evening, as they sat together by the fire, Henry decided it was time to be honest. Ethan, Henry began, his voice gentle, I need to talk to you about Thomas Grayson. Ethan looked up, his gray-blue eyes filled with unease. Is he coming back? I don't know, Henry admitted, but he's trying to. He doesn't want to accept the court's decision. Ethan's small hands tightened around his book. What does he want with me? Henry hesitated. I think he sees you as a way to get something he wants. But listen to me, Ethan. He doesn't care about you the way I do. And I won't let him take you. Ethan nodded, though his expression was troubled. What if he doesn't stop? Henry reached out, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. Then we'll fight. Together. For the first time that evening, Ethan's face softened. Okay, he said quietly. Henry smiled, though the knot in his chest remained. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he wasn't about to let Thomas Grayson or anyone else take away the family he'd found. Ethan was his to protect, and Henry was determined to do whatever it took to keep him safe. As the fire crackled softly, Henry made a silent vow. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he would stand firm. For Ethan, for Daniel, and for the life they were building together. Snow fell steadily outside, blanketing Chestnut Hollow in a pristine layer of white. Inside the house, Henry sat at the kitchen table with Claire, who had come over to review the next steps they might need to take against Thomas Grayson. Ethan, sensing the seriousness of their conversation, quietly played with a puzzle in the living room, though his occasional glances toward the kitchen betrayed his concern. Thomas won't stop, Claire said, her voice firm but calm. Men like him rarely do, but we've taken every precaution. The restraining order is filed, and the court is aware of his harassment. If he tries anything, we'll be ready. Henry nodded, though the weight of her words pressed heavily on him. I just want Ethan to feel safe, he said. He's been through enough. Claire reached across the table, her expression softening. You're doing everything you can, Henry. Ethan knows that. After she left, Henry spent the rest of the evening trying to put on a brave face for Ethan. They played board games and read another chapter of The Secret Garden, but Henry's mind kept drifting back to Thomas. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would test everything he'd fought to protect. That night, Henry awoke to the sound of the front door rattling. At first, he thought it was the wind, but as he sat up, he heard it again. A deliberate, jarring noise. His heart raced as he grabbed the baseball, but he kept by his bed and crept toward the living room. Ethan was already there, peeking out from behind the couch, his face pale. Stay back, Henry whispered, motioning for Ethan to hide. The door rattled once more before it burst open, the lock splintering under the force. Thomas Grayson stepped inside, his coat dusted with snow and his eyes burning with determination. Grayson, Henry said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. You've crossed a line. Thomas smirked, taking a step forward. I warned you, Whitaker. Ethan belongs with me. Henry tightened his grip on the bat, placing himself between Thomas and the hallway where Ethan was crouched out of sight. Get out of my house, he said firmly. Now. Thomas's expression darkened. You think a piece of paper can stop me? You don't deserve to keep him. You're an old man clinging to the past. Ethan needs someone who can give him a future. And you think that's you? Henry shot back. You don't care about Ethan. You care about control. Thomas's eyes flashed with anger, and he lunged forward. Henry swung the bat instinctively, the solid crack of wood against Thomas's arm sending the man stumbling back. Before Thomas could recover, Henry grabbed the phone and dialed 911. This is Henry Whitaker, he said quickly. There's an intruder in my home. Thomas froze, his face twisting with frustration. You'll regret this, Whitaker, he spat, backing toward the door. You think this is over? It's not. Moments later, the sound of sirens filled the air, and Thomas turned and fled into the night. Henry locked the door as best he could, his hands trembling as he called out for Ethan. The boy emerged cautiously, his wide eyes filled with fear. Is he gone? Ethan whispered. Henry knelt down, pulling Ethan into a tight embrace. He's gone, he said, and he's not coming back. I promise. The police arrived minutes later, taking Henry's statement and assuring him that they would issue a warrant for Thomas's arrest. As they left, Henry felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The ordeal had shaken him, but it had also solidified his resolve. He wouldn't let Thomas win. Not now, not ever. In the days that followed, Henry worked tirelessly to ensure that their home was secure. New locks, security cameras, and even a motion-activated light were installed, all with the help of neighbors who rallied around him and Ethan. The community's support was a balm to Henry's nerves, reminding him that he wasn't alone in this fight. Ethan, too, seemed to find solace in the newfound sense of safety. Though he was still wary, he began to relax, his laughter returning in small, precious bursts. Henry cherished those moments, knowing how much they had overcome together. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Ethan looked up at Henry with a thoughtful expression. Do you think my dad would have fought for me like you did? Henry's throat tightened, and he reached out to rest a hand on the boy's shoulder. I know he would have, he said. Your dad loved you, Ethan. He would have done anything to protect you. Ethan nodded, his gaze thoughtful. I think he'd be proud of you. Henry smiled, his chest aching with both love and gratitude. Thank you, Ethan. That means a lot. As winter began to thaw and the days grew longer, life in Chestnut Hollow settled into a peaceful rhythm once more. Thomas Grayson was arrested a few weeks after the break-in, and the restraining order was upheld with additional restrictions. Though the threat was gone, Henry remained vigilant, determined never to let his guard down. But more than that, he focused on building a life with Ethan. They planted a small garden in the backyard, read through every book they could find in the attic, and even adopted a scruffy dog from the local shelter, a shaggy mutt named Max who quickly became Ethan's loyal companion. On a warm spring evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ethan turned to Henry with a small smile. This feels like home, he said. Henry looked at the boy who had become the center of his world, his heart swelling with pride and love. It is home, he said, for both of us. And for the first time in years, Henry felt truly at peace. He had lost so much, but in Ethan, he had found something extraordinary, a second chance, a reason to hope, and a family that was stronger than anything Thomas Grayson or the world could throw at them. Together, they had built a life filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. And that, Henry knew, was the greatest gift of all.